Okay, we're going to talk about the healthy expression of anger here. And when we get angry, oftentimes we're defending our rights, and we have rights, and we have the right to defend those rights. But we can often get sucked into a hole of selfishness when we're concerned about defending our rights. And this is especially true for people that had childhood trauma, that had traumatic experiences during their childhood, because nobody looked out for their rights when they were children. And so as an adult, they are going to make sure that their childhood isn't repeated again. They're going to make sure that their rights are protected. And we can go overboard when we're doing that. And so our workbook suggests that we replace the word right with the word responsibility. Do I have the right to stand up for a certain thing? Instead of saying, do I have the right to stand up for this, do I have the responsibility to stand up for this? Because even though I may have the right to do something, I may not have that responsibility. And so then we can really question our motives. Because like I said, when we have a traumatic childhood, when we have that in our past, it is very easy to go overboard as adults. Think about a little child whose mother or father locks them in a closet for a punishment. There's no light in there. They don't feed them. The child has to go to the bathroom in there, so he has urine or feces in that closet, and they're stuck in there for hours and hours, and they're banging on the closet wall, let me out, let me out, let me out. And an experience like that happens multiple times during their childhood. Might not be exactly like that, but they are helpless, they are being abused, and they have no escape. And that happens over and over again multiple times in their childhood. I understand this because I was never locked in a closet, but I was locked in a food pantry once, but I was never abused in that exact way, but I was abused in other similar ways. So I understand this example, or this, if we want to say it's a metaphor. Then as an adult, something happens to us. And because that traumatic experience happened while our brain was developing, our brain is now hypersensitive to the bad things that can happen in life. And so as soon as we feel threatened that we might be locked into that closet, we start banging on the door, metaphorically. And we can very easily go overboard. And we can view something as a threat that is not necessarily a threat. And so instead of worrying about our rights, it is more helpful. It helps us live more emotionally balanced if we instead simply ask ourselves, do I have the responsibility to defend here? And then we are not as inclined to go overboard. Anger protects our needs. So anger is not a bad thing. If we have a need that is not being met by somebody, or by an institution, or by a government, or by a society, and we get angry about that, that anger can be a helpful thing if it is expressed properly. And that's where we go wrong. Delivery, expressing our anger, that is where we go down the wrong path. And then our anger becomes not only destructive to ourselves, but destructive to other people. And in the end, we don't wind up getting our needs met, because the focus becomes our anger instead of the need that we are angry about, the need that is not being met. And this has happened to me many times in my experience, where I have expressed my anger in a form that is not healthy, and then the need that is causing me to get angry isn't even focused on. What the focus becomes is on my expression of anger. So when we express anger in a healthy way, then the focus becomes the issue that is making us angry. So let's take a look at 3 areas that we need to refine in order to express our anger in a healthy way. The first is boundaries. We need to learn how to set and maintain healthy boundaries if we are going to express our anger in a healthy way. The second area is assertiveness. We need to learn how to be assertive in expressing our anger if we are going to be productive and healthy when we express our anger. And the third is forgiveness. We must learn how to forgive if we are going to be able to deal with anger in a healthy way. Let's talk about boundaries. Boundaries are something we place upon ourselves, and that is that when we interact with people or circumstances around us, when we come in contact with a certain situation, we decide how we are going to react, and that is our boundary. An example would be a wife that cooks supper for her husband, and her husband, the time he comes home from work is completely unpredictable. And so he might come home at 6 o'clock, or he might come home at 7:30, or he might be coming home at 9, or he might even get home at midnight. And when he gets home, he gets angry and he demands that his wife stop whatever she's doing and fix him supper. If she's already gone to bed and sleeping, he'll tell her to get up and fix him supper. So the wife then makes a boundary, and she tells the husband, I am going to fix you supper every single night, and I'm going to have it ready at 6:30. If you get home before then, you can wait until 6:30 to eat. If you get home after then, you can put it in the microwave and warm it up. You can scream, you can holler, you can pick up chairs and throw them around the room, but I am not going to fix supper at any other time. Now, she might also create boundaries and other boundaries and say, if you do pick up chairs and throw them around the room, I'm taking my children and going over to my parents' house, and we will stay there until we get into family therapy and the therapist suggests that we come back home. If you wake me up in the middle of the night to fix you supper, I will take the children to my parents' house, and we will stay there until you go to family therapy and the therapist suggests we move back home. These are examples of boundaries. They're boundaries that we're placing upon our own behavior. So she is not telling the husband, you need to be home at 6:30 every night. The husband is free to come home at 9 o'clock or at midnight. That's up to him. She is not telling the husband, you cannot throw chairs around the house. She is simply telling them, if he does, this is how I am going to react. If you wake me up in the middle of the night, this is how I'm going to react. You are free to throw chairs if you want to throw chairs. Kids and I are going to my parents' house. You can come home every single day and throw chairs around the house. We're not going to be there. That's just a boundary. Those boundaries are limits we place upon ourselves. We don't place them upon others. So we're not telling them what they can and cannot do. What we are telling them is what our reaction is going to be. We are placing controls upon our own behavior, not upon theirs. And that is what boundaries are. So when we set boundaries, one thing that we should maintain is that differentness should be celebrated. Oftentimes people try to place us in a mold and make us behave or act or look the way they want us to. Diversity in many places, for many reasons, is a good thing. Now, are there exceptions? Well, when one person is violating the rights of another person, let's say, for example, a bully on a playground that is going out and bullying other children, well, that's behavior. That is a type of behavior that is not acceptable, because he is violating the rights of somebody else. So he can't come and say, well, I'm just different. I like to be a bully, and you guys need to appreciate my bulliness and let me be a bully. You shouldn't discriminate against me. Well, no, if my behavior is infringing upon the rights of somebody else, then that type of differentness is not to be accepted. But let's give an example of differentness that should be accepted. For example, I am a Seventh-day Adventist, so in my religious practices, I go to church on Saturday instead of going to church on Sunday. Other people should not take an issue with that. I'm not telling other people that they need to go to church on Saturday too. If they want to go to church on Sunday, or if they don't want to go to church at all, that's their decision. But my decision is to go to church on Saturday. As a Seventh-day Adventist, I may decide also to be a vegetarian. And that's different than most of society. I may decide not to wear jewelry. And that's different than most of society. But that doesn't mean that I'm infringing upon anybody else's rights. And other people should not pressure me to conform to the way they do things. You understand the differentness there. Now, in the society that we live in today, we live in a multicultural society. So we have people that are very different. We have some Arabs that like to wear a certain headdress. And there are some people that they don't like that. They don't like Arabs dressing that way. But that is a differentness, and the Arabs should not have to apologize for the type of clothing that they are wearing. Correct? The Amish men wear a certain type of beard a certain way. And nobody should be telling them that they shouldn't wear a beard that way, right? That is differentness. Differentness can be celebrated. Then when we get into things like music, different people like different types of music. Right? And so this differentness can be celebrated. Now, we also live in a time that we have issues like the LGBTQ plus community, and they want to celebrate their differentness. And as long as they're not infringing upon the rights of others, they should be allowed to have their differentness as well. Differentness can be celebrated. Now, some people will say, oh, Shane, LGBTQ, I mean, you're talking about some of those people are homosexuals. How can we allow that? That's their personal decision. Now, if they were to come into our religious assembly places, like into our church, and tell us that we can't preach certain ways, then they're infringing upon our rights. And right, they don't have the right to come in and tell certain religions that we cannot preach against certain ways. For example, Southern Baptists have very strong convictions that homosexuality is a sin. And so in the Southern Baptist worship facilities, in their churches, they have the right to preach against that. Correct? They believe that drinking alcohol is a sin. And they have the right to preach against that, right? But people that believe that it's not a sin, they can go down to the local bar and they can ask the bartender to serve them a drink. They pay for it and they can drink alcohol. So nobody's going to stop them from drinking alcohol at the bar. But at the same time, that guy that's drinking alcohol at the bar, he doesn't have the right to go into the Baptist church and start telling them that they shouldn't preach against drinking alcohol, right? The Baptist can preach against drinking alcohol, and the guy at the bar, he can order his alcohol and he can drink it. They both have rights to do that. And when we come to the LGBTQ plus community, it is the same principle. They have the right to believe what they believe and live as they want to live, as long as they're not infringing upon the rights of other people. Differentness can be celebrated. We don't have to try to force other people into our mold of thinking. And really, the way, if we want other people to think like we think and to live as we live, the way to do that is to model the behavior, be an example, show other people how our way of living promotes love and how it promotes happiness and how it promotes peace and contentment. And then if they're ever to be converted to our way of thinking, they're going to see our example and say, you know, that group of people has something that I want. I would like to be happy and content and have peace and serenity in my life. What are they doing that is different than what I'm doing? And that is how we can draw people into our community to believe with us. If we think that they are behaving in a different way that we don't think is appropriate, it's not where we should try to force them to do things differently, but rather we just live out an example so that they will be drawn to our way of life because they can see the results of living that way. So the part that was a very long speech, you might say, about introducing boundaries, but it's good to know what we're talking about here. So we're not the same as other people. Each one of us is unique, and we don't need to apologize for that. If you're a vegetarian, that's fine. You're a vegetarian. If you don't like eating broccoli, that's fine. You don't have to eat broccoli. If you don't like classic music, nobody should force you to listen to classic music. You are unique, and your differentness can be celebrated. A lot of people that are depressed are just uncomfortable in their skin. They're not comfortable with who they are. And sometimes they think that if they conform to other people, that'll make them happy. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it depends upon what we're talking about. You know, for example, if you're behaving in some self-destructive behavior, like you're abusing drugs, and then you see somebody else that is going to church a couple of times a week, and he's living his life differently than you're living your life, and you think, you know, if I do things the way he does things, maybe my life will get better. Well, to a certain degree, that's probably true if you're engaged in self-destructive behavior. But even then, even if you're going to quit using drugs and get into a recovery program, you're not going to become an exact replica of somebody else. You're still going to be your unique person. And that uniqueness can be celebrated, and you can feel comfortable in your skin without having to become a clone of somebody else. Sometimes we're afraid to let people know what our needs are, and sometimes that comes from a fear of rejection. And so we don't stand up for ourselves, we don't stand up for our needs because we're afraid to stand up for them. And part of assertiveness is standing up for our needs. Because we don't stand up for our needs, people are not mind readers, and they're not going to know what our needs are. Then our needs are going to go unmet. We're going to get angry about it. We may suppress that anger, and we become depressed. So we need to let people know what our needs are. That's part of being assertive. Then opening up about our differentness. You know, if you're a vegetarian and you go out with a group of friends and you get the menu, it's okay for you to tell your friends that you're a vegetarian. Now, there's some differentness that we may not tell people. There's some things that are more personal than other things. And so we shouldn't need or feel the need to tell everybody every detail about us. You know, there's some things that are just downright personal. You know, for example, maybe you have hemorrhoids, and because you have hemorrhoids, the doctor tells you that you need to avoid certain foods and eat foods that have high fiber. Well, when you go out with your group of friends, you don't have to, and you go to a restaurant, you don't need to announce at the table to everyone that you have hemorrhoids and so you have a medical diet that you're following. Some of that stuff is TMI, right? Too much information. We don't need to tell everybody everything about us, but in general, we shouldn't be ashamed of some of our choices. For example, if we're a Seventh-day Adventist, we go to church on Saturday. If we don't wear jewelry, if we're a vegetarian, we don't like classical music. It's okay to be different, and it's healthy to let other people know a number of those things. We can stand firm for who you are. So if you're a vegetarian and you tell your friends that you're a vegetarian and they start pushing back and telling you that that's extreme and you're crazy, and we shouldn't feel like we have to change who we are because they don't like it. It's like, if you don't like being a vegetarian, then eat meat, but don't tell me that I should have to eat meat. I've had people, when I've told them I was a vegetarian, I've had people want to argue with me about whether or not fish is meat or not. And it's like, what do you care? If you eat meat, what do you care if I eat fish or not? What business of that, or is that of yours? But we can stand firm for whatever our convictions are and whatever our lifestyle choices are, as long as we're not harming other people, as long as we're not infringing upon their rights. We can be who we want to be. But it does get to a point where we have to respect others that disagree with us. So we don't want to be adversarial with them. We don't want to look for fights. We don't, for example, if I'm a vegetarian and I go out with a group of friends and one of my friends orders a hamburger, I shouldn't sit there and say, man, that's a dead animal you're eating. That's a carcass. That's blood. What are you, a vampire? I shouldn't try to provoke my friends or ridicule them or try to humiliate them. I shouldn't use my uniqueness in that way. I find a verse in Romans chapter 14, verse 13, and it kind of talks about that theme where it says, determine this, not to be a stumbling block in your brother's way. So it's okay to be unique, and our uniqueness should be celebrated. But let's not allow our uniqueness to become a stumbling block for somebody else, right? We don't want to cause them a problem, but at the same time, we don't want to allow them to push us around and try to make us feel like we need to fit into their mold. So let's talk about assertiveness. And we've already talked about standing firm when we talked about boundaries and not letting people push us into a certain mold. Well, another way of standing firm is when we are letting our needs be known, whatever the issue is. We speak up and we say, this is my opinion, this is what I think. And we don't need to get aggressive where we are yelling or screaming, calling names, insults, humiliating people, but rather we are just stating in a very direct tone that this is my need. This is what I need. And sometimes we might be placing a demand on somebody else and saying, this is what I need you to do. That happens oftentimes in the workplace where a manager that's in charge of a subordinate, the manager has to tell the subordinate, this is what I need you to do. Or a parent telling a child, I need you to clean your room, whatever it might be. We stand firm, we speak in a direct tone of voice, but we are not yelling, we're not screaming, we're not insulting, we're not humiliating, we are simply standing firm. And that is being assertive. No need to convince others. Sometimes we can get into the point where when we make a statement and other people disagree with us, that we feel like we have to engage in like a political debate to convince them of our point of view. Assertiveness does not require that. Many of times I've been in business meetings where somebody disagreed with the position that I took, and I simply said, well, I guess we're going to have to disagree. we're going to have to agree to disagree. And they want to enter into a debate about it. And I'm not here to debate. This is what I believe. This is my position. You believe differently? Okay. Let's see how that works for you. This is how I believe. I stake my claim, right? And you hold on to your position, I'll hold on to my position. I don't need to convince you of mine. And that is part of assertiveness. Don't get angry that they won't agree with you. Don't start whining and trying to manipulate them. No. This is my position. If you don't agree with me, you're free to disagree with me. We can agree to disagree. We are no longer a child needing to comply. And sometimes we get into this situation where people disagree with us, and it's like a flashback to our childhood of when our parents told us to do something and we had to comply with them. We're adults now, and that's not the case. Of course, we have to comply with the law. If the police officer pulls you over and says, "Let me see your driver's license," of course, give him your driver's license. If the law requires something, if you are in the store and you're trying to purchase like alcohol, and the cashier asks you for your ID, well, you show him your ID. Whatever the issue is, or you're using a credit card and they want to see your ID. You're trying to give somebody a check and they want to see your ID. Well, you get my point. We need to comply with the law and not be so stubborn. But in many respects, these people are not our parents. And we don't have to comply with them. Maybe you are in an employment situation, where a boss makes demands upon you and you feel like it's your parents making demands on you. Well, if he is giving you a paycheck or she is giving you a paycheck, certainly they have the right to require you to do certain things. But some employers abuse their rights as well, and many states have labor offices where complaints can be made. But ultimately, you can quit that job and go find another job. Now, I suggest finding another job before you quit the job you have. But you get my point. It's not like your father or your mother. You can't quit the family and just go get another father or mother. You're stuck with the father or mother that you have. But you can switch jobs. So your boss is not in the same position that your parents were when you were a child. Maybe a little similar, but not the same. And when we are being assertive in our expression of our anger, we show other people dignity. That means we do not call them names. We do not humiliate them. We do not insult them. But we show them dignity. Now, those that know the story of the Bible know the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. And this raises a question among some. Jesus goes into the temple, he gets very angry. And people say, Jesus got angry, and the Bible says that he didn't sin. What's that all about? Well, the Bible does say that Jesus never sinned, and Jesus did get angry in the temple twice, on two different occasions. He got angry in the temple at the beginning of his ministry, at the very beginning, and then also at the very end of his ministry. So what he did in the temple, he did on two different occasions. Now, Jesus got angry at other occasions as well in the Bible, and we see stories of these in the Gospels. Now, the other occasions when Jesus got angry, he showed assertiveness. He showed a good example of assertiveness. In the temple, we see an example that borderlines on aggression. You could certainly make an argument that he was aggressive in the temple. And some could make the argument, well, it borderlined. It was like assertiveness to the max, So maybe it wasn't aggression. But the case can certainly be made that it was aggression. First off, his anger in the temple was righteous anger. What is righteous anger? Righteous anger means there was no selfishness in it. Jesus had nothing to gain. He had not been cheated out of any money. His needs were not being unfulfilled. No one had hurt him. No one had done anything wrong to him. He had nothing to gain. by getting angry in the temple. It was zero selfish motive. Later we see when he was being beaten and crucified and his rights were being violated, he did not get angry. So when people did lash out and hurt him, he expressed no anger. He actually prayed and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So what was going on in the temple? In the temple, the issue was twofold. One was certainly that it was the house of God, and he was defending the house of God. And the other issue there was social justice. What was happening was this was during the Passover, and people would come from all parts of the world with various currency. Even a lot of them probably had Roman currency. But when they got into the temple, in order to purchase animals that were required for sacrifice, they had to have the temple currency. So the temple currency was not the same as the Roman currency. The temple had its own currency. And so you had to go in and trade your currency for the temple currency. It would be like going to Mexico with US dollars and having to exchange them for Mexican pesos. You had to exchange the currency. And one thing that was happening were the people that had the currency, they were not giving a fair trade. So, let's say the peso is worth 20 pesos to $1 US, and you go to an exchange service, and instead of giving you 20 pesos for $1 US, they're only giving you 15 pesos for a US dollar. So that was going on in the temple there, is that people were going in there and they were getting cheated. They were not being given a fair amount. And then those that were selling the animals were charging exorbitant prices. They were charging way too much for the animals. So this is why Jesus referred to them as a den of thieves. They were all just in there, and they were using religion. They were using religion, and they were using the temple, which is a holy temple, to fraud people, to steal from people, to commit fraud. And so Jesus got upset for two things: what they were doing to God and what they were doing to his fellow man. It wasn't an issue of what they were doing to him, but his anger was a righteous anger. Friends, you and I'll tell you, I bet I have probably never been righteously angry in my whole life. Now, I have seen people do things wrong, and I have stood up for minorities, and I have stood up for impoverished people. But when I've done that, I normally was involved in it as well. It's, for example, if we look at the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr., and he led the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And very admirable. I support everything he was doing. But he had something to gain from it too, right? So he was doing a good work. I'm not going to argue that. But he did have something to gain from it as well. So even though what he was doing was good, he gained something from it. And I've been in similar situations where I've done a good work in defending racial minorities and defending impoverished people that are being taken advantage of. But when I did that, I also had something at stake as well. So I was never in a position where Jesus was in the temple, where he had nothing to gain from what he was doing in the temple. It was purely righteous anger. His focus was on God and on others. He was out of the equation. And so my point is that his example, although the argument can be made that it was for aggression, his example may not be real applicable for us to say that Jesus did it in the temple, I can do it too. Jesus also maintained self-control. And some people might balk and say, how did he maintain self-control? He made a whip and he drove people out, and he overturned tables. It looks like he lost control. Well, first off, remember who we're talking about here. We're talking about the Son of God. He could have struck them all dead, right? He could have called fire down from heaven to incinerate them, right? Nobody got injured. He did drive everybody out, and he overthrew tables. But he didn't pick up the money and steal it, right? The money laid there on the floor. And what happened to it? If I were to venture to guess, some priests probably came by later and picked up the money, and it went into the temple treasury. That would be my guess, but who knows what happened to it. But Jesus certainly didn't steal it. He didn't take it for himself. He did demonstrate some self-control there. In the other instances where Jesus got angry in the New Testament, we see much more of a case for Jesus showing an example of assertive anger. Well, remember, at the end of time, when Jesus comes, he's going to take the righteous to heaven, and the wicked are going to stay here. And God does call it a strange act in Isaiah, but he's going to destroy the wicked with fire. And the same God that is going to destroy the wicked with fire in hell, he was the one that went into that temple and overthrew the tables. That's not you, right? And that's not me. Let's talk about forgiveness here. Remember that poor choices are optional. And what do I mean by poor choices? I'm talking about suppressing our anger. I'm talking about passive-aggressive anger. I'm talking about aggressiveness. Those are options. Now, granted, we have predispositions, and some of us are predispositioned to be aggressive, and some of us are predispositioned to suppress our anger. But through lifestyle choices we can make choices to change and adapt behavior, adapt some coping mechanisms that will eventually teach us how to deal with anger assertively, and then we do not have to make those choices. It is a process, but we can decide to go down that path. So we don't have to make poor choices. Now, bear in mind that reality may never be what we want it to be. And that is that people may never treat us the way that we want them to treat us. And we may, if social justice is something that gets us upset, it may never change. If we have a relative that is very difficult to get along with, they may never change. If we disagree with some laws of the nation that we live in, they may never change. We need to learn acceptance. The Serenity Prayer says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. When I learn how to accept the things that I do not like and I cannot change, is when I start learning how serenity can be part of my life. Now, let's contrast suppression with forgiveness. Suppression is like fake. Okay, somebody does something to us and we pretend that it doesn't bother us, but it does, and we suppress that anger. Forgiveness is authentic. Somebody does something wrong to us, we release them from our condemnation. We give ourselves permission not to condemn them. We turn them over to God. And that's ultimately what forgiveness is. We tell God, He's yours to deal with. That means recognizing our limits. See, we are not God, so we don't have the power to punish people for their sins. We turn them over to God. We release them to God. And we say, God, this person sinned against me. He did something wrong against me. I am not going to seek revenge. I am going to leave it to you, God. He's yours. You deal with it. And that is how we can love our enemies. We release them from our condemnation. That is what forgiveness is all about. And forgiveness is an option. When we get angry, we can forgive the people. We can forgive the institutions. that caused us to get angry. Well, all this takes effort. It's not easy. There is hope and there is treatment, there is recovery. We can get out of depression and we can be free from anger, but it takes work. Part of that is learning to leave our comfort zone. We like to stay in what is familiar to us, even when we're not comfortable in that. We like things that are familiar. This is why a lot of people will stay in a toxic situation. If it's a toxic workforce or whatever it might be, they'll stay in a toxic situation because it's familiar. And if we are going to get through depression and get past anger, more than likely it's going to involve leaving our comfort zone. One of the things we can do is mindfulness. Mindfulness is where we focus on the present. And one of my practices is I simply take the alarm on my cell phone and I set it on 5 minutes, a timer there. And then I put on some very relaxing music and I close my eyes in a quiet room. I listen to that soothing music and then I recite a short Bible verse through my mind for 5 minutes. And the timer will eventually go off and tell me when the 5 minutes is over. Now, I focus on the present. And so what am I doing? I'm sitting in a room, I'm relaxing, I'm listening to nice music, and I'm reciting this Bible verse over and over and over, and I'm focusing on that Bible verse. And then my mind starts to stray and wander onto other things, and I reel it in. I pull it back in and focus on that Bible verse. And I just do this for 5 minutes. Some people will do it for 10 or 15 minutes. But I do this for a specific period of time, and that is mindfulness. It's like doing push-ups for your brain. It's training your brain how to focus and how to control itself. And for those that had traumatic childhoods, this is very, very good for learning emotional control as an adult. Also, journaling. I do a lot of journaling. I do journaling in the morning and in the evening. Write down my memory verse. I write down some positive things that have happened to me. I write down some gratitude, things that I'm grateful for. I normally do a written prayer to God. Write down how God showed up to me that day and the way I saw God working in my life that particular day. If I read a passage of Scripture, I might write down what God is telling me through that passage of Scripture. A lot of journaling I do. Now, a resentment inventory is also a good part of getting past our anger. What is a resentment inventory? Resentment inventory is when I list everybody I am resentful at. Then I list what they did, and then I list what part of self was affected. Normally that is like my self-esteem, my financial security, my emotional security, my social life, my love life, my pride. Because normally if I'm resentful at somebody, it's because they impacted me. I don't normally get resentful at somebody that does something to our neighbor that doesn't affect me. Normally they affect me, or if they do something to one of my family members, then I might get resentful at them. And so I do that resentment inventory. How did they affect me? And then, did I play a part in it? Did I do something to provoke them? Or after they did something wrong to me, did I return bad for bad? They did something bad to me, so I did something bad to them instead of turning my other cheek. Did I do something wrong? And I put that in my resentment inventory. Now, our workbook suggests a practice that I call a depression inventory. And if you got your workbook, you can open it up and look on page 53. And here I can just read you some of these questions here. It says, think about the origins of your depression. Who has frustrated you? Who has let you down or treated you unfairly? Openly acknowledge that you are normal in your feelings and hurt and betrayal. Then ask, have I done all I can to constructively establish my boundaries, my uniqueness? Have I been willing to speak out when necessary? Am I committed to an honest communication about my feelings, even if the person is not? Then question, can I choose to live without bitterness and defeat, even if the other person fails to respect my convictions? Though I don't like unresolved conflicts, can I pursue my goals for healthy living in spite of the lack of cooperation of others? That's a depression inventory, and that is very useful in getting out of our depression. Then there's the issue of confronting others. Now, this is delicate. One way, people that have harmed us, do we go and talk to them? I'm going to venture out and say in most cases it's not necessary and it's not beneficial. But one thing that is beneficial is to write letters to them. And then after writing letters to them, take that letter and read it to your counselor or read it to a good friend. Get that out of your system and then toss it in a fire and burn it and be done with that resentment. Most of the time we don't need to confront the people that have harmed us, but it does help us to write them a letter and then vent that with somebody else and then burn it. Forgive them. It's over. Now, anger is not always associated with depression. It is oftentimes. And so in your specific case, if you're struggling with depression, you may not have an issue with anger. But oftentimes, anger is part of our depression. And so we had to spend some time on this issue of anger in this series. Now, I want to ask for your understanding with this video. I know there's a lag in these videos. I guess my computer probably needs to be replaced. I am recording this with a PC, and the PC, it's a little laptop, about 6 years old, probably needs to be replaced. Maybe there's too much stuff on the hard drive. I'm not that computer savvy. But the most helpful part of these sessions is the audio and some of the text that is being shown on the screen. And so it's not really that important that my lips match my words, right? You seeing my face bob around on the screen probably isn't going to help you with your depression so much. It's more the message of what we're talking about. And ultimately, being able to find that joy of the Lord, that the Lord has for us. And things get in the way of that. And if you are struggling with any anger in your life, unresolved anger and anger that is not managed properly is certainly going to get in the way of experiencing the joy that the Lord has for us. There is some work, like I outlined here, a resentment inventory. And, if you take this seriously, you can get a notebook and you can probably fill up a notebook at least halfway full. And some people, I've known people that have went through a complete notebook and went into a second one with all their resentments. But you follow that suggestion that I put down and then do a depression inventory. And that can be, very helpful. Now, I don't know if you're seeing a counselor or if you're talking to a pastor or your best friend, but if you are, you can do this resentment inventory, do the depression inventory, and then go over it with them as well. And that can be helpful. I'm going to close this session now with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you wanting to make changes in our life. We are learning new ways to look at things, and we're learning some tools that we can start using that will help us gain a perspective and gain some control over our emotions. We want to give to you our broken selves. We realize we're not perfect and we're broken, but you can heal us. And we are willing to do what it takes. We are willing to spend the time and make the effort so that we can start to live the way that you would have us live. So not only can we experience more peace in our life, but we can be of a greater blessing to those that are around us. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.